We're now at the end of the World War II unit, which we've been doing for the last couple of weeks. Today's lesson is going to wrap it all up. We're going to do a quick review, and then I'm going to give you, just to help boost some of your grades, we're going to do kind of a check for understanding. It's not really a quiz, but I'm going to put it in the grade book or label it as a type of quiz, which will hopefully boost some of your grades a little bit higher than where they are. Right now, we'll explain that in a little bit, but before we do that, let's just do a really quick review of where we've been in the last couple of weeks. In the last 3 or 4 weeks, we looked at the Second World War, probably the most destructive event in human history, but also one of the ones that is probably the most important for the world and what the world looks like today in the year 2020. In the last unit, in the last chapter, we looked at how World War II started in Europe. We looked at how it started in Japan. We looked at the atrocities that took place in the Second World War, the Holocaust. We saw the droppings of the atomic bombs. We saw the war crimes committed by Japan in Asia. We also saw how the Allies ultimately went. We ultimately see how the United States and the Soviet Union and Britain and France all emerge as the victors, all emerge as the winners of the Second World War, while the fascist countries of Germany, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan end up losing the Second World War. And then finally, we ended by looking at some of the challenges that the world faced after the Second World War. One of those challenges is, yes, rebuilding. This is the most destructive war in the history of ever. But there are going to be two other big things. There are going to be two other big challenges that pop up that we'll see at the very end of our review. And that brings us to today, right? So in today's class, what we're going to do is we're going to review the big picture of what we learned in the World War II unit. And then you are going to go off and complete the Chapter 32 check for understanding. So World War II, very quickly. Again, I'm going to give you kind of the big picture here. If you need to go back to the chapter readings while you do the check for understanding, feel free to do so. You can always refer back to your chapter readings. This is just going to be like a big picture narrative of what happened in World War II. So the first thing that we looked at is how the war started. We looked at a lesson called Hitler's Lightning War. And we saw how Adolf Hitler, the Nazi dictator of Germany, was using sudden attacks called Blitzkrieg, or lightning wars, where he would take over a country basically by surprise. And in this way, Germany overran large parts of Europe and North Africa. You may remember he invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. That is what starts World War II. But then a few months later, he goes and then does the same thing in France and takes over France in a matter of less than a month. As a result of these Blitzkrieg campaigns, Britain and France declare war on Germany and its allies. Remember, Germany had on its side fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. Now, Hitler, after taking over Poland, large parts of Balkans, large parts of North Africa, taking over France and its colonies, he tries to take over Britain. In fact, there's this big thing called the Battle of Britain, where for about a couple of months, I think it's 2 or 3 months, he's just launching airplanes to bomb London, to break their resolve, to make the British give up. And yet the British do not. The British defeat, the British stop Hitler from taking over their island. But this also now means that Britain is the only country technically at war against Nazi Germany. The United States is still officially remaining outside of World War II until we get attacked by Japan. Now, meanwhile, what was happening in Europe is happening at the same time as what Japan is doing in Asia. Japan is trying to build an empire in Asia. They go around, they go into a place and they say, hey, we're trying to build an Asia for the Asians. We're kicking out the Europeans, we're kicking out the white people. But in reality, what the Japanese were doing was building an Asia for Japan. They were building an empire, just like an empire that the British had, just like the empire that the French had, and in many ways, a much more cruel empire. Now, Imperial Japan was worried about American influence in the region. It's really hard to tell on this map because the U.S. is just on the other side where the world turns away. But the U.S. is sharing the same ocean as Japan, right? Like it's the same body of water. And so we actually have a major influence in the Pacific and in Asia. Japan's worried about this. And what they want to do is they want to launch a surprise attack They don't want to start a war with the United States. Their goal, because they know they'll lose that war. They are a much smaller country. They are not as wealthy as the United States. They know that they will lose a war against the US. What their goal is to land such a big punch against the United States that it will force the US into negotiation. What they basically want to do is destroy the U.S. fleet in the Pacific enough that the U.S. cannot fight against Japan, at least for a couple of months, at least for a couple of years. When Japan launches their surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, yes, it is absolutely a shock. Yes, it is absolutely a surprise to Americans. However, the United States does not go to the negotiation table with Japan. Instead, they do what Japan was afraid of, and they declare war on Japan. And when we declare war on Japan, we are also declaring war on Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So now we are joining the British in this fight against the fascist countries, against the Axis. Note before I move on that there is also, I mentioned France was defeated, France was conquered, but there's a big French resistance, which is why I say France is part of the victors or one of the victors in World War II, because there are a lot of French people who absolutely abhor, they are absolutely terrified of what Hitler and the Nazis are bringing into the world. And there's this big French resistance inside of France, but even outside of France, there were soldiers, there were people called the Free French who were just waiting outside of France, waiting for the opportunity to go back and to liberate France from the Nazis. We also spoke about the atrocities. We spoke about the Holocaust. 6 million Jews killed during World War II by the Nazis. Remember, the Nazis they had this anti-Semitic, but it's not just anti-Semitic, it's racist, right? They believe that they are the master race. They believe that blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, they are better than everyone else, even though, yes, Hitler's brown-eyed, brown-haired, and a lot of other Nazis look nothing like the ideal Nazi. That's their problem, right? But what we know is that they absolutely believed it, and they went out, and during World War II, in the places that they controlled, they systematically killed millions, tens of millions of people. The Jews were the biggest group, but they were not the only group by and far. There are some people who would even consider the Nazi killings of Russians to be a part of the Holocaust. That bumps up the number to something like 11 million. It is an insane amount. It is very difficult to comprehend the level of suffering, the level of death brought on by the Germans in the Second World War. But they weren't the only ones, right? We also looked at how Imperial Japan also committed atrocities, also committed crimes against humanity, against Asia, against countries in Asia, against the people in the Pacific, against American soldiers, against British soldiers, right? It was not uncommon to hear about vivisections. That means they were cutting men up alive to see, or to do medical experiments. I'm not going to go into the full details, but it is a fascinating wormhole to go down because you don't normally hear about that when people talk about World War II. We usually talk about what Germany is doing, but just know Japan's also doing some pretty bad things. And then on both sides, the United States, Britain, just like Germany and Japan and Italy, they saw civilians as legitimate targets, which means on both sides of the Second World War, non-combatants, men, women, children, the elderly, they were seen as targets, right? So the United States, amongst other countries, right, we go out and we level entire cities, places where just normal people were living their lives. We do this in Tokyo. We do the fire bombings of various Japanese cities. There's fire bombings in Dresden, in Germany. Not to mention the fact that the United States drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, on 2 separate cities. All of this happens, right? This is the most destructive war in the history of humanity. The important thing to know is that the United States, Britain, France do emerge victorious. We did talk about the Allied victory. We saw how in the European theater in Europe, the Allies, including the British, the Americans, and the Free French launched an attack on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and they landed over the course of 3 or 4 weeks nearly 1 million troops on the beaches of Normandy, on the beaches of northern France. And these millions of soldiers, it actually ends up being about 3 million forces, are going to sweep across France. They're going to sweep right along the German border, ultimately crossing the Rhine, ultimately entering Germany, Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Union, the Russians are also attacking from the east. And we basically have the Germans surrounded. In May of 1945, I skipped ahead. In April of 1945, the Soviet Union takes over the capital of Germany, Berlin. Hitler kills himself. A few weeks later, Allied forces, British and American forces also entered the city of Berlin. By May of 1945, 75 years ago, Nazi Germany officially surrenders. However, in the Pacific, Japan was not surrendering. Japan did not surrender when Nazi Germany did. And the US has been fighting for years, doing island hopping, taking over island by island by island by island. I spoke about in more detail the arguments for and against the atomic bombs being dropped in Japan. You can go back and look over those videos. I'm not going to have that conversation in this lesson, but just know that the US does drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August of 1945. That anniversary is coming up, and by September of 1945, about a month after, the Japanese officially surrender. Hideki Tojo, who was the equivalent of a dictator in Japan, is arrested and tried for war crimes, and he is eventually executed. Meanwhile, the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, who actually lived until about the 80s. I think I actually was around. I was born very close to the time that he passed away. He continues to live out his life, but he is forced to admit to the Japanese people that he is not divine, that he is not a god or godlike. And that about wraps up the Second World War. Now, as I've been mentioning multiple times, as you've been able to see, World War II is the absolute most destructive thing, the most destructive event in human history. We ended by looking at Europe and Japan in ruins. Now the world is being tasked with rebuilding. Nazis, fascists, imperial Japanese war criminals are being arrested left and right. There's the Nuremberg trials where the Nazis are being held on trial so the world can see what they did. The Japanese, there's a similar trial taking place in Japan for their war crimes. And a lot of these fascist leaders, the reason why fascism stayed down for a long time is because a lot of them died. A lot of them were executed. And to also prevent the outbreak of another war, right? The United States and its allies also go through a process of making Japan demilitarize. They wanted Japan to make its army very small, basically so that it's only good for self-defense. And the same thing with Germany. Now, that leads us to the 2 biggest consequences of the Second World War, other than the US and the Soviet Union and Britain winning. The 2 biggest consequences are that the old empires, remember the empires that we spoke about before the shutdown? Remember the scramble for Africa? Remember how Europeans were going into Africa, how they were going into South Asia, what we can now call India? Remember how the Europeans were going into Asia? Those empires are starting to fall apart. World War II is so expensive, it is so destructive that the old empires, like the British Empire, which used to be the most powerful country in the world, is now basically falling apart. This is going to lead to a process of decolonization, which is starting where people who used to be colonized, who used to be conquered, are now going to say, this is a great opportunity for us to now be free. If you guys fought this really destructive war, supposedly for freedom, supposedly for independence, supposedly for liberty, supposedly for all these great things, why do you still have these empires? Why don't we get to be free like you? And that is going to be one of the big stories of the years and the decades following the Second World War. But then the second story is that look at the victors. Look at the people that came out of the World War, the 2 world wars, the most powerful countries in the world. The United States emerges as the superpower alongside the Soviet Union, Russia. So now we live in a world after World War II where the United States and the Soviet Union are the 2 big superpowers. They are the 2 biggest countries, the 2 most powerful countries in the world in the years and the decades following the Second World War. And guess what? They do not get along with each other. The United States has one type of system, a capitalist democracy, whereas the Soviet Union had another system, communism. Now, the tensions between these 2 countries are going to lead to something that we call the Cold War. But the Cold War and decolonization will be the subject of next week's lessons. just understand that this is all like the world that we are living in. Even today, even though there are people actively trying to dismantle the way the world works, it is very much a world that is set up because of the way that the Second World War ended. Um, we will absolutely talk more about that in the last 2 weeks before we go on to our summer break. But for now, for you, I want to give you the opportunity to bring up your grades. Now, the way the grade book works is each grade has a category. We haven't had a quiz right in a while, so I'm going to count this check for understanding as a quiz, but it's an open note quiz. If you want to go back into the old chapters, into the old sections that we read the last couple of weeks, feel free to do that. Feel free to look them up in the chapters. Because really this is just an opportunity to make sure that you understood some of the big ideas, but also, I want you to do well. So if you need to go back and you teach yourself something, go for it. If you need help with the check for understanding, my office hours are today from 3:15 to 4, as per usual, or you can email me at amaduena@laalliance.org. But until then, until I see some of you in office hours, or until we meet again in August or September or October, I will start signing out. Make sure that you guys stay safe and stay healthy. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Because I do want to see all of you nice and healthy in the fall. But again, until then, closing out. I'll see you guys later.